Chapter 15, Lessons. Friday night at the Kenton house was family movie time. But tonight, Ross and Edward had gone out to their high school with their high school friends, which was fine with Greg. That meant he got to pick the movie. By 7:30, Greg had the house, or had his mom and dad, half the couch, a big bowl of popcorn, and a bottle of root beer, and a good old Indiana Jones all to himself. The movie started with a bang between the action and the music and the sound effects. Greg barely noticed the doorbell, barely noticed his mom getting up to answer it. She came back to the family room and said, "Greg, it's Mara Shaw." With his eyes still on the screen, Greg said, "What?" She said, "Put your movie on pause." When the room was quiet, she said, "It's Mara Shaw at the door." "Mara," Greg said. "What's she want?" His mom shrugged. "She just asked if you were home." Greg took a quick sip of root beer and got off the couch. Mara stood at the door. She held a big brown mailing envelope, and before Greg could say a word, she handed it to him. "New drawings?" "I did them after school. And you have to look at them before I make any more to tell me how I am doing. I know I've got the size right because they're just like the ones on your crayon story. And I used good art paper because I know you have to put ink on them. But you have to tell me about everything else." Did Mara ask, "Is this a bad time?" "No." Did she say, "I'll leave these with you. Can you look at them?" "No." She stood there, tapping her feet, bossy as ever. Greg hated cold popcorn, and he wished he had kept his mouth shut about Mara's pictures. He ripped open the envelope and yanked out the papers so he could whip through them. Then he could push the intruder out the door and get back to his movie. But Mara's first picture grabbed him and pulled him in. She had done the cover art. The picture focused on the unicorn, its long, twisted horn poking all the way up through the word unicorn in the title. A nice touch, but best of all, Mara had drawn dark woods with the scary outline of bare trees, and in the distance the tower, and in the bottom right corner of the picture an org lurked in the undergrowth, eyes huge, jaws open. Greg nodded. "Great cover, really. This is great." Without thinking, he sat down cross-legged on the front hall carpet and flipped through the next picture, which was page 1, where the unicorn first realizes she's lost. The small page was split in half from the upper right corner to the lower left corner, which made two panels shaped like a triangle. The top panel showed the frightened creature walking down the forest path, looking back over her shoulder. The dividing line was a jagged lightning bolt, and below it there was a close-up of the unicorn's eyes looking up at the storm clouds, with woods and the darkness crowding it. Still nodding, Greg looked at the third drawing and said, "This is good too." Mara had already figured out how to use every bit of space, a big challenge on such tiny pages. One larger panel helped the reader understand the whole scene. and other smaller ones zoomed in on the most dramatic details. She had also trimmed the story down into a real comic book script. The words were penciled into the speech balloons. It was Greg, it was his dad. Should we hold the movie? No, it's okay, Greg called back. I've seen it, and I have to help on this a little. It's some drawings. We'll be down in the playroom. I'll be there later. At the moment, Mara's sketches were a lot more interesting than the Temple of Doom. Greg wanted to try inking one or two of them. Here, he handed all the drawings back to Mara and pointed her toward the basement doorway. Go down there. I've got to get some stuff from my room. 3 minutes later, Greg carried a bin of his art materials into the playroom. He dragged a chair over and set up a work area on the ping pong table. He took Mara's cover picture out of the envelope, hurried upstairs to the family room, ignored his mom and dad and the movie. He made 2 copies of the cover, practice sheets. Greg trotted back to the playroom, sat down, chose a small brush, dipped it into a bottle of India ink, and began to experiment. The unicorn was going to be white, so that meant he had to darken everything around it. He loved working with the sharp contrast of black and white. He put down the brush, picked up a pen, and dipped its thin metal point into the ink. Time to add some details to the unicorn's mane. Mara came in and stood behind him, craning her neck to see. Greg ignored her. She moved to his right side, put a hand on the ping pong table, and leaned in closer. Hey, Greg said, don't shake the table. Well, what am I supposed to do? She asked. Do whatever you want. Watch TV, go home, but don't shake the table. Here, take this paper and a ruler, and there are pencils and erasers in the bin. Make some more drawings. You can sit over there. Mara set up a little workspace on the low table in front of the TV. She sat on the floor with her back against the couch, facing Greg. She shuffled through her envelope on papers. She got out her story script and found the next page she wanted to work on. She used the ruler to draw boundaries for the page. Then she made a few marks on the paper. She looked at them and then erased them all. She made another start, but then stopped and rubbed it all out again. She couldn't get into it, and she knew why. Sitting on the floor in Greg Kenton's playroom was just too weird. Mara got up quickly and tiptoed over next to the ping pong table. She stood at Greg's elbow, watching him add tiny lines with a crow quill pen. When it looked like a good moment to speak, she said, I forgot to tell you, I really want to do all the lettering myself. Greg looked at her and made a face. Well, I can't be in cursive like you used. It can't be in cursive like you used before. It's too hard to read, especially when it's small. How's your printing? Are you kidding? Said Mara. Miss Layton, in 3rd grade, She had to force me to use cursive. I was so good at printing. Greg reached for a lettering pen, the kind with a point that's almost like a needle. He unscrewed the cap and slid a piece of lined paper toward Mara. Here, this is the kind of pen you have to use. Don't push hard or you'll wreck it. Try writing something. Mara made a few marks to get the feel of the pen point, and then she wrote, "This pen is different, but I like it." Greg looked at the sentence and nodded. Pretty good. It was actually neater and clearer than his own lettering, and he'd been working on his for 2 years. He said, But you'll have to practice and get a little smaller, and you have to keep watching how many words you use. The fewer the better." "I know that," Mara said. "Oh, so now you're an expert, right?" "No," snapped Mara. "But I'm not dumb. I really do get it. How the pictures have to tell most of the story. So don't talk to me like I'm an idiot." Greg bit back a perfect insult. He pointed at the other table and said, "So go be a genius over there, okay? I'm trying to get something done here." For the next 30 minutes, there was no talking, only the soft scratching sounds of pens and pencils on paper. Greg's mom came to ask if they wanted something to eat, but she stopped halfway down the stairs and then crept back up. She didn't want to interrupt because what she saw, reminded her of two kindergartners at the art tables. Each child bent over some work, each completely unaware of the other, which wasn't quite true. Yes, Mara was working on a new mini page, and she was in the quiet creative zone in her mind, but in the back of her thinking, she wished she could just walk over and stand behind Greg, watch him lay down those clear brushstrokes and impossibly thin lines of ink. The kid was creative, smart too, and almost nice sometimes, like when he'd apologized in the lunchroom earlier in the day, and even when he was acting all tough and mean, he was still funny, like when he'd made her buy the ice cream sandwich as part of the deal. Mara had to admit it. Sometimes Greg was actually sort of cute. And Greg hadn't forgotten that Mara was sitting 10 feet away. He glanced up at her every few minutes, just a flick of the eyes, as if to make sure she was still there. Her talent was amazing. She seemed willing to try anything. Of course, any minute now, she would probably go nuts again and do something that would make him want to strangle her. But when she wasn't trying to rule the world, like when she kept her big mouth shut and just sat there, wrinkling her nose at the drawing, Mara wasn't that bad to have around. And to think of it, a girl who loved comics? How cool was that? Almost an hour later, Greg broke the silence. "There, 2 pages and the cover, all inked. You get anything done?" Mara nodded and stood up stiffly. 2 more pages." She walked over and laid them on the ping pong table. Greg stood up and pulled Mara's new penciled pages closer, and he reached over and spread out his finished inked work in front of Mara. Then both of them leaned over the table, each inspecting each other's work. They were both impressed with the way they saw what they saw, but there wasn't any gushing. Yeah, those are okay, Greg said. Mara nodded. Yours too. The phone rang and Mara said, Bet you anything that's my mom. It was, and Mara had to leave. Here, Greg said, take these home and do the lettering. You can borrow my pen. Mara nodded, and Greg sat down and went back to work. She said, I'm going to bring over more pictures tomorrow. Greg shrugged. Whatever. Then he thought a second and said, but don't come until about 2. He had promised to wash both of the Jansen's both of the Jansen's cars before noon, and he had Saturday chores around home to do. Plus, both his brothers might be gone by 2 in the afternoon. They were always worth avoiding. Mara gathered her things together and left. Greg didn't walk up to the front door with her. Didn't even say goodbye. He was too busy. Greg stayed at the ping pong table almost another hour, and before he went up to say goodnight to his mom and dad, he had finished inking 2 more pages. As he lay in bed looking at the patterns that the street lights and tree branches made on the ceiling, Greg thought about the evening. Inking Mara's drawings had been so different from working on his own pictures. He felt like he had to be more careful with hers. Careful not to put too many of his own ideas into them. Careful not to change her drawing style. And he had to admit it, the results were good. But as he drifted toward the edge of sleep, there was something else he would not admit. Admitting this other thing would have been too dangerous because Greg wouldn't admit because what Greg wouldn't admit was that he was almost sort of a little bit, maybe halfway, glad about Mara coming back to work on her comic again on Saturday at 2.